One of the most catastrophic events in history took place in Ukraine, in the city of Chernobyl. It was a nuclear accident that saw an unaccountable loss of life, peculiar impacts on the environment, and disturbing after effects. Number 10. The 26th of April in 1986 was like any other day in Ukraine. For residents of the city of Chernobyl, though, things were about to take an ominous and unexpected turn. It was still the era of the Cold War, a period marked by nuclear research and progress. Situated in Pripyat was the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, its primary purpose being to generate electricity. 4 units were present at the plant, each of which went into operation on different dates starting in 1978. Things had supposedly been running smoothly until that fateful day. It was that date when a sudden power surge destroyed Unit 4, sparking a fire and a disastrous nuclear fallout. Radioactive materials ran down on the environment and the nearby Pripyat. Immediately, fatalities were reported, not only from the initial explosion, but also from radiation exposure. Some victims would only succumb to the effects years later, others instantaneously. Among such victims were the first responders of the Chernobyl disaster. First responders included firefighters who were sent to douse the aggressive flames and contain the nightmarish event. All across Kiev, 37 fire crew loaded their 81 engines and transported 186 men right into the smoke plume. They were just doing their jobs, rushing in to save lives and ensure that the accident wouldn't become worse. Only those firemen weren't informed of the radioactive dangers they'd be walking into. In fact, they arrived at Chernobyl wearing no protective gear, aside from the standard fireman jackets and heavy work boots. The firefighters rushed toward the searing blaze, unaware that they had just been exposed to a silent slayer. The responders knew that the roof of Reactor 4 was made of asphalt, making it combustible and forcing flames to run through the rest of the building. As they were conjuring up their plans to contain this disaster, the uranium dioxide present in the core's fuel rods was exploding. The rods, along with radioactive graphite used for slowing down the speed of neutrons, were burning simultaneously. This was the perfect recipe for highly toxic smoke that seeped from the roof. With 70 tons of uranium and 900 tons of graphite fueled by the fires, radiation was leaking into the air every hour, 7 times the lethal human dose. As efforts were underway to douse the flames, some of the firefighters began making their way to the fire escape of the reactor, where they would run their hoses to cool the core, which by now had reached a temperature of 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit. Soon, the men would begin to feel the effects of the uranium and required a rescue operation themselves. By the time they were yanked from the burning building, they were already weakened and ill. Some firemen arrived at the scene only later, but by this time they were aware that they were risking their lives to stop the fire from reaching Reactor 3. For 10 days, the smoke plume lingered, setting off alarms in Sweden and depositing radiation into bodies of water as far as Japan. Some firefighters survived the fallout, while others succumbed to its effects in mere days. By the time they were buried, they were so radioactive that they were placed in coffins made from lead that were welded shut and buried in the soil, preventing them from contaminating the area for a further 26,000 years. Number 9. Located just 3 kilometers away from where this catastrophic disaster took place was the town of Pripyat, which saw a population of more than 49,000 people. As the air became irradiated and began to spread across the immediate area, cleanups and evacuations were being arranged. At the 36-hour mark, the town was almost completely evacuated, and in the weeks to follow, another 67,000 people within the vicinity of Chernobyl were removed from the areas and relocated, leaving their contaminated homes behind. It's believed that around 20,000 people were relocated as a direct result of the disaster. Adding to the disorder, massive cleanup and contamination efforts commenced in the weeks and months to follow. During these efforts, liquidators, the collective term for the firefighters, miners, janitors, and soldiers, were sent to Chernobyl to tackle the burning reactor. Once the flames were doused and a protective housing was established around Unit 4, the focus could be placed on making the environment habitable again. This endeavor would be a lengthy process, one that still hasn't been completed in its entirety. In 1997, 40 governments would combine more than $1.5 billion to create an environmentally friendly zone. The funds would be placed towards reconstruction, development, and remediation, but there were already permanent alterations made to the environment. A nearby forest was left reddened. Birds had smaller brains. Frogs were turning a different color, and other organisms were seeing a complete genetic remake. With all of these features in mind, it comes as quite a shock to most that despite the massive nuclear fallout, Chernobyl's nuclear power plant still continued to operate for years. The only difference was that Unit 4 was no longer being used. The other 3 reactors, which were just as unsafe, were still running, albeit $400 million had been spent on improvements for said reactors. Their safety was supposedly enhanced, and apparent energy shortages necessitated their continual operation. Despite the area being a radioactive ghost town, workers were still expected to attend to the plant to ensure its performance. At least 600 people would work there daily, with their radiation dose being within internationally accepted limits, allegedly. Among those 6,000 was a small team of scientists working in the wrecked Unit 4 building itself. A new town was even set up 30 kilometers away where families would take up residence. It seemed that the plant was now well contained and new safety measures had been instituted. But then, another fire erupted. This time it was Unit 2, which caught fire in 1991 and was immediately shut down. Following closely behind in 1996 was Unit 1, which was decommissioned following an international outcry in relation to health effects and radiation poisoning. Although there was a second nuclear incident that could have resulted in another radioactive fallout, Unit 3 still continued to operate. By now, the effects of radiation had become apparent. The environment was suffering, and so were the people. It wouldn't be until 2000 that the final unit would be decommissioned, and the nuclear power plant would finally shut down for good. It took 14 years after the worst disaster in history to be realized for something to be done to prevent another such occurrence at the same plant. What's even more disturbing is that the 1986 Chernobyl disaster was not the only accident that occurred at the nuclear power plant. Number 8. Absorbed in the soil, lingering in the air, and attached to the leaves of the trees, radiation still stuck around even years after the fact. This comes as no shock, since 400 times more radiation was released by the explosion than what was produced by the atomic warhead. By the 2nd of May, days after the catastrophe, the Soviet Union declared an off-limits area around the site and named it the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. The zone is roughly 1,000 square miles of radiation, the most irradiated environment in the vicinity of the plant. The government and the scientists cordoned it off for this reason, hoping that people would stay away from the dangerous area. Guards have even been employed at the checkpoints and within the area itself. Ukrainian military protects the zone, ensuring that no illegal entry occurs. The guards also play a role in caring for the stray dogs that were left behind. They feed them and even provide them with medical care. Despite the restricted access and presence of radiation, there are still some who are occupying the ghost town. They're the residents of the exclusion zone. But these inhabitants are not being forced to stay there with no other place to go, but instead made the bizarre choice to move into the crumbling ruins that border the area. Although it lacked amenities and opportunities, the Kovalenko family packed up their things, traveled hundreds of miles across Ukraine, and settled down near the exclusion zone. They reside in a crumbling home where floorboards rot and metal radiators lay in an unfixable state. Their food is self-grown, and livestock are kept for milk and meat, with their only source of income being state benefits. Another resident who lives within the exclusion zone itself was Ivan Semenyuk, a former resident of the village who survived the initial explosion and years of radiation poisoning. Ivan, a self-settler, decided to move back to his village along with his wife just 2 years after the event. And they weren't alone there. During an interview with the irradiated resident, he explained that he grows his own food, including potatoes, beetroot, and cabbage. When jokingly asked if the food grew extra big, hinting at the effects of radiation, Ivan responded, "Only when it rains." A sad response that referred to the fact that the downpour washes fallout from the trees, allowing it to settle in the soil, and ultimately absorb into the food. Ivan and his wife were only two among 200 residents of Chernobyl. These self-settlers found themselves spread across 162 villages that all fall within the highly radioactive zone. Life here is lonely, the only company being the radiation that's present in the living room each hour. Although some claim to have never felt any effects from the toxicity. In fact, Ivan has had very few health problems. And oddly, many of the inhabitants are living beyond the average human life expectancy, making for a very bizarre turn of events. Number 7. Making a strange and unexpected appearance in the irradiated ecosystem are numerous forms of wildlife, including dogs, wolves, birds, and frogs. In fact, some years after utter disaster sent humans fleeing Chernobyl, the fauna flourished. With minimal human impact, the area saw a surge in animal populations, including that of the badger, white-tailed eagle, red deer, short-eared owls, and even the endangered Przewalski horse, all of which called the exclusion zone home. It seemed that the eradication of the human population led to nature taking over, reclaiming the land that it once owned. The ghost town became overgrown, allowing horses to roam the landscape, owls nesting in the abandoned doorways, and even bison passing through the zone, seeing it as a grazing opportunity. Among the creatures that now take up residence here are Eurasian lynxes, moose, and bears, who now call it home. Foxes posed on the empty pavement and beneath hazard signs, cooling pools overflowed with catfish. This would be the last thing anyone would expect from the toxic environment. Most would assume that the area would be unfit for animal habitation, but we forget that they are far more adaptable than us. As trees sprouted from the empty buildings, 200 bird species appear, including black storks and golden eagles. Insects have returned, along with various amphibians, all contributing to a maintained and stable ecosystem. But their primary occupancy here hasn't been without consequence. Scientists studying the sudden influx of animals discovered an amazing amount of asymmetrical insects, cataracted voles, and even albino barn swallows. Even though there's been some negative impact, adaptation still allowed many animals to flourish. Studies found frogs who lived within the exclusion zone were significantly darker than their non-radiated counterparts. This may be a way for them to resist the effects of radiation, according to scientists. Wolves lingering in the wasteland have been found to have an altered immune system, seemingly immune to the cancerous atmosphere. Swallows that roost in the zone allegedly carry a bacteria resistant to gamma radiation. The stray dogs that are fed by the residents and guards also seem to have been bizarrely affected by the radiation. Studies found that since the 1986 disaster, these abandoned dogs have had their genetics fundamentally altered and have become the perfect candidates for learning how radioactive environments may affect larger dogs. Animals weren't the only ones affected either, but the flora was too. One well-known impact was on a nearby forest that was in close proximity to the initial explosion. As the blast ran over the area, it left the trees strangely altered. The leaves had turned red, but the trees continued to thrive. Nicknamed the Red Forest, it's become one of the greatest mysteries of the exclusion zone. Among the debris, strange flora, and adapting fauna, scientists would discover an unlikely survivor. It was a black fungus that seemed to be quite resilient to the toxic environment it was now living in. Patches of black took over the walls of Reactor 4, seemingly thriving where the radiation was at its highest, which would be lethal to many other life forms. Further investigation of this mysterious fungus also determined that not only was it thriving in radiation, but it was actually eating it and using it as a source of energy, much like how plants use the sun for the photosynthesis process. Number 6. As the power plant spewed plumes into the air, filling it with radioactive material. Officials were trying to decipher a plan on how to contain the fallout. Less than 2 months later, they landed on a temporary solution: the sarcophagus. The Soviet Union sent cleanup workers to the site, tasked with creating some sort of durable covering that would be built around the reactor. Various designs were examined, with the chosen option being a massive structure of reinforced concrete. Over 600,000 workers were involved and began building the massive covering that would contain the reactor, support the walls that remained, and around 220 tons of hazardous material. The covering would be made from 16 million pounds of steel and 400,000 cubic meters of concrete, which was hoped to be enough for a sturdy design. By August of that year, sensors had been installed to monitor gamma radiation. An outer wall was also erected around the perimeter, and a steel roof would complete the sarcophagus. But this was a hasty construction that took 7 months to complete without proper plans in place. It isn't shocking to discover that shortcuts were made, and the sarcophagus, while still effective, was flawed. As workers attempted to contain the damage without being injured themselves, they failed to seal the building joints, and openings were left in the ceiling. These unfortunate gaps allowed corrosion to set in and radiation to spew out. As a consequence of this quick build, the covering was viewed as a mere temporary solution, a barrier pending a more secure design. The workers' attempts to not be harmed were also futile, since at least 31 of them would later succumb to acute radiation sickness. The sarcophagus was made to protect the environment from further damage, but it would only last 30 years. A decade after its construction, an attempt was made to stabilize the shelter. The supports had been weakened by the corrosion, though it was still relatively sound. But the sarcophagus would not be able to withstand natural disasters, such as an earthquake, a concern that had many on edge. Eventually, with all the flaws present, the cover began to crack. The start of the deterioration prompted an international effort to create a new casing, and in 2004, the new building, named the New Safe Confinement Structure, was approved by the government. As the construction of a new casing was underway, workers were still trying to secure the sarcophagus. They installed some scaffolding to bear some of the weight, and by 2008, the roof would be held up by the buttresses. The government then awarded Novarka the building contract for the new casing. The new safe confinement structure was a 32,000-ton outer shell that was established 980 feet away from the reactor and then moved into place once it was completed. Its parts were assembled in Italy and delivered to the site via 18 ships and 2,500 trucks. In 2010, construction began, and 4 years later, with the sarcophagus still deteriorating, its framework was complete. By November 2016, the completed shell was finally rolled into place and became the largest land-based object ever to be moved by people. Number 5. A blackened plume carrying hazardous materials made its way across Europe. Radioactive dust was recorded as far as the eastern United States, and rainfall acted as a vehicle to transport toxic isotopes to the rest of the world. It's commonly known and widely acknowledged that rain removes and deposits atmospheric-borne materials, including radiation. At around 3 p.m., days after the disaster in 1986, a mass of dark, heavy clouds began floating their way across the landscape, unleashing an unforgiving downpour. It was at that moment that rehearsals were underway for the May Day parade. The seemingly simple rain sent participants running for cover. The wind was strong that day, carrying the rain even further. For 40 minutes, torrential rain fell over the town. It wouldn't be until the following day, though, that some would realize what had happened. A professor who taught a class called Nuclear and Chemical Reconnaissance was about to demonstrate something to his students. He held a military-grade Geiger counter, expecting it to return the usual trace amounts of background radiation. But instead, as he turned it on, Mr. Sizov watched the dial climb to a level that he'd only read about in textbooks that spoke of a full-on nuclear attack. Alarmed by this, he made contact with the Civil Protection Headquarters. They discredited the professor's report, claiming that it was impossible. But it was possible, because just 3 days earlier, the worst nuclear event ever took place. It wasn't only in Russia that nuclear rain was pouring down. The hazardous plume spread throughout Europe, lingering in Poland, and then headed northward to Ireland. On the 2nd of May, air filters in Glasnevin saw a sharp rise in radioactivity, signaling the moment the plume arrived in Ireland. Ultimately, the radioactive isotopes were deposited into the soil, leading to contamination of the ground and vegetation, including produce. Vegetables and fruit were now infected with toxic isotopes that were washed from the clouds and from the leaves on trees. England was affected too. Days after the disaster, residents were enjoying some clear weather, and they unexpectedly were disrupted by unusually heavy downpours, 20 millimeters in just 24 hours. On the uneven terrain, radioactive fallout began to pool in puddles and rivers, measuring 200 times the natural background radiation. Topsoil was hazardously irradiated. The residents were assured that the materials would soon be washed away by more rain, but 2 months later, the levels rose even higher, this time in southwestern Scotland. Vegetation wasn't the only thing affected by the fallout. Scientists had tested sheep, only to find out that they contained levels of radiation that made them far too high for human consumption. The food was all contaminated, a direct effect of radioactive rain. The efforts to contain the fallout had been futile. There were already microscopic poisons present in the air and making their way across large land masses. Number 4. The Chernobyl disaster is among the most well-known catastrophes ever to have taken place in history. Most know the summed-up version of events, the one that states that the Unit 4 reactor exploded, unleashing unimaginable horrors. But the sequence of events that took place was far more detailed and traced back years before the actual disaster itself. The day before the event took place, Unit 4 was scheduled to be shut down for routine maintenance. Researchers decided to seize the moment for some testing. They wanted to see that if a loss of station power were to occur, if the slowing turbine could provide sufficient power to operate the core cooling water pumps until the diesel power supply became operative. The aim was to figure out if core cooling could continue without power. But the test was carried out without the necessary communications, exchange of information, and coordination. So both plans were carried out, and an operational error occurred that sent the power to fall. As a result, numerous control rods were withdrawn, violating the minimum operating reactivity margin. A chain reaction was set off that saw the slowing turbine run down and warm feed water entering the core. Boiling is believed to have taken place at the bottom of the core, allowing it to become increasingly hotter, with no safety measures in place to cool it down. Then an increase in power, which continued to rise, was noted. Fuel elements ruptured, and the Chernobyl disaster commenced. The catastrophic event was created not only by a lack of safety regulations, but also by miscommunication and just poor timing. But this wasn't the only Chernobyl accident to have occurred. There had been several incidents that had taken place in the build-up to the event, all of which were covered up or ignored. In 2020, the Archive of the Security Service in Ukraine, known as the SSU, along with the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance, unsealed some previously archived documents relating to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. These pages noted the presence of multiple accidents that had occurred before 1986, which no one had been informed about. If they had, perhaps these missteps could have been avoided. On the 9th of September in 1982, Reactor 1 at the nuclear power plant saw a partial core meltdown. This occurred due to a cooling valve being left closed during routine maintenance. Once the reactor came back online, the uranium was overheated and would subsequently rupture. While the extent of the damage was minor compared to the 1986 disaster, it was still a warning sign that went ignored. According to documents, another set of serious accidents took place in 1984. This time, it was Reactor 3 and Reactor 4, the same one that would explode 2 years later. KGB documents revealed that at this point, the government was fully aware that the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was the most dangerous plant within the Soviet Union. This was due to concerns regarding the building's structural integrity. The steam separators that were housed in a room would exceed temperatures of 270 degrees Celsius, leading to cracked concrete and building movements. Despite having knowledge of this, the radioactive plant was allowed to operate. Then we arrived at that fateful day in 1986 when Reactor 4 exploded, leading to open-air fires, radiation fallout, and terror. Number 3. Further adding to the ignorance of an avoidable nuclear disaster was the fact that on the 26th of April, the emergency safety systems had been turned off. The failure of Reactor 4 directly claimed 31 lives and indirectly took tens of thousands more. Although the plant itself was host to flawed and unsafe designs, there was something more at play here that contributed to the event. Culture in the Soviet Union during this time discouraged speaking up about mistakes or raising concerns. Peddled by the fear of authority and the unspoken need to please the political figureheads, a compliance-driven culture emerged, which wasn't the optimal outlook for workers of a nuclear power plant. During the planned power shutdown, operators who were in charge of the process and concerned about its safety were not able to raise their concerns. These worries included the potential aftermath that turning off the emergency safety system would have. The lack of safety culture allowed a potentially hazardous test to ensue, with operators being too afraid to speak up about the dangers. Workers commenced their poorly planned experiment, shutting off the reactor power regulating system. The control rods from the core were withdrawn, allowing it to run at 7% power. With no emergency systems in place, power being shut off, and no concrete containment or water moderators, the test was carried out, resulting in a nuclear meltdown. Just before 1:30 that morning, an out-of-control chain reaction ensued, triggering a fireball to blow off the concrete lid, and radioactive material from the graphite core was released into the atmosphere. But the poor safety culture practices didn't end there. Following the disaster, the government attempted to cover up the mistake, but once they reluctantly admitted to what had happened, an international outcry ensued. Amidst the efforts to clean up the disastrous mess, the aforementioned sarcophagus was built. Again, safety measures were ignored, leading to a structurally unsound container being built around the reactor. Also, amid the cleanups, most responders had not been informed of the dangers they'd be facing, leading to the immediate demise of some. With no masks or protective suits, people entered the zone. Adding to this was that there was no safety measures in place for the event of a nuclear fallout. The failure to do so resulted in great blackened plumes traveling across the country, the continent, and even across the seas. Despite having now acknowledged the poor decisions that were made that day, the government still allowed the plant to operate, letting it continue to pose a risk to the environment. Workers still tended to their daily routines and were entrusted not to make the same mistake of a poorly planned experiment. Had the safety systems not been turned off, or the lack of safety culture not been apparent in the Soviet Union, the Chernobyl disaster may have never happened, or at least would have had a less negative impact. Number 2. Many of the things that happened right after the Chernobyl disaster took place are nothing short of bizarre, from a lack of safety measures to uninformed first responders and amusement parks operating, to musical troops being brought into the exclusion zone. On the 1st of May, days after the Chernobyl disaster, the Pripyat amusement park was scheduled to open. But it wouldn't be to welcome visitors or tourists, but instead an effort to entertain the residents who were still being relocated. They just suffered the worst trauma imaginable. They watched loved ones succumb to radiation sickness. They got ripped out of their homes, displaced, and many were sick. In an effort to reel in the distress, responders began to figure out a way to calm them. The Ferris wheel at the Pripyat amusement park began to turn. The trees and soil surrounding it were blackened, making for an ominous and sad scene. But taking a ride on the wheel only brought things into perspective when they reached the very top. Their homes lay in disarray. Everything was darkened and abandoned. So responders began searching for another method of calming the civilians, and they landed on a performance group. At the time that Chernobyl had taken place, a man named Yuri, a former student of the University of St. Petersburg, had been touring the Soviet Union with his colleagues in a state-sponsored musical ensemble. Yuri studied classical piano, and his colleagues played different instruments. When radiation spewed out the top of Reactor 4, that very ensemble would be gathered in the city of Pripyat. Their mission was to entertain the locals who'd been displaced and traumatized. 3 men played their instruments while a ballerina spun and pranced to the tune. Yuri and the troupe knew something sinister had taken place, something that residents were not directly informed of. There were soldiers everywhere, and they'd been forbidden to directly speak to any of the locals. These details, paired with the sickness and demises of some of the townspeople, made it clear that something terrible had taken place here. As the effects of radiation poisoning were underway, the ballerina danced, and the piano man played his tunes. It was at that very moment that Yuri and his colleagues began to accept the idea that they might not make it out of there alive. Their last performance would be like no other. As the ballerina delicately danced with the wind, vital fluid began to flow from her nose. She'd already been poisoned. In the days to follow, more members of the ensemble would begin to fall sick, some even succumbing to the radiation. The performers of Chernobyl were housed on the outskirts of the city when they weren't performing for the locals. Soldiers were stationed outside, ensuring that the irradiated performers wouldn't make an escape. Knowing this, Yuri made his attempt anyway. One evening when all had gone quiet, he climbed out of the window, but he locked eyes with a soldier. But that soldier understood his need to flee and let him go. He too didn't want to be there. Yuri would ultimately be the only survivor out of the entertainers, and the only one to carry on the story of the performers of Chernobyl. Number 1. Radiation is indiscriminate. Anything within close proximity will find itself irradiated. Soil, air, water, food, animals, foliage, even people. In the event of the Chernobyl disaster, this is precisely what happened. As the government and scientists began to realize the dangers of radiation, we would think that they would ensure that the toxins wouldn't run rampant and that contaminated things wouldn't make it beyond the exclusion zone. But as we've already seen, safety was not of the utmost concern here. Within the borders of Chernobyl, valuable things like meat, milk, and wool were found to be contaminated. Despite this, they were shipped out of the exclusion zone and put right onto our plates. The items were distributed around the Soviet Union except for Moscow. The area had also been populated by farmers, and within a mere week, officials had come to load 50,000 heads of cow, sheep, and goats. The irradiated livestock were placed onto flatbed trucks and shipped to nearby areas where they awaited slaughter. Half of them would be sent to the abattoir, while the others were seen as too contaminated. Nonetheless, the meat would be graded by levels of radioactivity, thoroughly washed and then mixed in with fresh, clean meat. Those contaminated products would then be sold all over the country, but wouldn't make their way onto the plates where most Soviet officials lived. The wool from Chernobyl sheep was no different. The Ministry of Industrial Agriculture recommended that workers treat the wool as any other. In doing so, many of these factory workers would find themselves falling inexplicably ill just months later. By fall, monitors indicated that the wool factories saw a radiation level double the permissible norm. As time went on, personal stories would arise too. One came from Marat Kokhanov, a former nuclear engineer. For a very long time after the disaster, he alleged that he would use milk, powdered milk, and concentrated milk from the Rogachev milk factory in lectures as a standard source of radiation. The factory had been distributing the contaminated milk from Chernobyl cows, and residents were consuming it. It was being sold in stores without advertising its potential toxicity. But when word spread that Rogachev was doing this, people stopped buying those products. In response, unlabeled milk cans made it to shelves. Most disturbingly, the nuclear fallout was seen as an opportunity for some. Villagers would collect contaminated fruits and attempt to sell them to passers-by. The difference is, unlike the corporations, they willingly disclosed that the items were infected. And still, people bought them, but only for one reason. They wanted to use the radioactive products to make someone sick. Some bought them for their bosses, others for their mother-in-laws. Allowing contaminated products to flow beyond the exclusion zone further revealed the ignorance and lack of safety culture that was present within the country. The Chernobyl disaster went beyond Pripyat, not only carried by rain, cloud, or wind, but by contaminated food, wool, and livestock. Dairy products, grains, meat, vegetables, and even fish saw a drastic increase in radioactive isotopes, and no safety measures were put into place to prevent further contamination of the Earth's inhabitants, only leading to further sickness and loss of life. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.